Hi Aquarius Sun and Aquarius Rising. This is a video about the transits of Jupiter and Saturn into your sign of Aquarius in December of 2020 and what you can expect. I've decided to do them together because they're both in the same sign, in the same house, and therefore it makes sense to kind of talk about what each planet may provide, and also how will they synergize? Is that the word? How do they work together? And do they cancel each other out because of what they represent? We could talk about all those things. And also the fact that it's in your sign. So whether you're Sun in Aquarius or Aquarius rising, this can affect your first house, because we're looking at it from this perspective of the solar chart or the natal chart if this is your rising sign. So every 12 years, Jupiter goes back into your sign. So you can kind of, I would say you'd have to kind of look it up to find the exact dates when this happens, because sometimes the transit of Jupiter takes 13 months, and of course that's going to throw things off a little bit. But approximately in, if we're talking about 2020, then it would be approximately 2008, the last time that Jupiter was in Aquarius. And you could think back to then of what was going on in your life. Now, it's very interesting because when I think of 2008, one of the things I think about is when Pluto went into Capricorn. Why is that relevant to the last time Jupiter was in Aquarius? Well, again, but that can be a reality check in a place that is not about reality, that is about fantasy and things that are not tangible. And so, Saturn is all about tangibility, so it creates a lot of conflict, in the sense, an inner conflict, because you may have been holding on to certain delusions that must be eliminated in order for you to start a new cycle again and have a clean slate, if you will, because the 12th house, you could say, are those kinds of things that you have to, what do they call that? Loose ends that you have to kind of tie together and move into a new cycle. So that first house becomes a new cycle of Jupiter and a new cycle of Saturn. Now, Saturn has 30-year transits, and if you are a certain age, you will be going through either your first, your second, or I guess you can have a third Saturn transit if you're old enough, maybe in your, around the age of 90, I guess. I don't know how many viewers I have that are that age. There might be a couple, but definitely the first or second Saturn transit, and these have their own unique, qualities to them, and challenges, and also blessings. But Aquarius is co-ruled by Saturn, so it's ruled by Uranus, which is kind of the more out front and noticeable or relatable planet that rules Aquarius based on what Aquarians stand for. But Saturn is the other ruler, and Saturn, actually, you can see in some Aquarians conservative tendencies, which go along with what Saturn represents. And so the bottom line is that having Saturn, a transit of Saturn in your sign, isn't bad in general, but it's especially good if it happens to be your ruler. because you are aligned with that energy. So let me talk about what Jupiter can bring in terms of the first house. And this goes along with what I was just saying about Saturn being your co-ruler, because you may also have inner planets in Capricorn, which is the ruler of the sign that Saturn rules, that we always think about. And Capricorn is a very serious sign. Saturn is a very serious planet. So with Jupiter in the first house, especially when it forms a conjunction with your ascendant. So depending on what degree your rising sign is, if this is for, or your, degree of your sun sign, this will show up even more so at that time. So what we're talking about is this kind of a cheery, positive nature. And that's what I was getting at, is that I think that a lot of Aquarians, they tend to be, they get accused of being aloof, which simply means, detached socially, maybe friendly, but in a kind of a distant sort of a way, not, really wanting that emotional intensity or intimacy, but more of a kind of I don't know if I'd say democratic type of affection that is given to all people equally. And so there's no preferential treatment. I don't know if that's true, but you know what I mean. Just kind of like friendly, but not necessarily that warm. But you might be more kind of like bubbly, or just kind of outwardly positive, and even maybe gregarious when Jupiter is in the first house, especially when it's close to the ascendant. And this may surprise even you. You can, one aspect of this that's kind of warning against certain things is not to be overly optimistic, not to think that you can do more than you actually can do, not to be too puffed up, where you have delusions of grandeur, because Jupiter is a planet of expansion, and that can expand the ego. And the first house is the house of the self. Sometimes they also talk about the physical body. The first house can be the physical body, and how that relates to the person's physique. Now, typically, they say, watch out for a Jupiter transit in the first house, because you could gain weight. Now, obviously, if you're underweight, that might not be a bad thing. But if you are watching your weight and you don't want to gain weight, luckily, Saturn is there, so that can counter any tendency towards overindulgence and just kind of that overly optimistic sense of self that might be more inclined to say, oh, that's not going to add weight or something like that. And who knows, maybe it can even be letting down your guard and just being, too much of a good thing. So any way that this manifests, whether it's in terms of your habits or your actual demeanor, where you take on more than you really can do, or you take risks that are kind of like a little bit overly optimistic about whether or not the situation can work out. But it can also make you more able to achieve success without trying as hard. So things can flow more easily to you. And the other thing is that this is, Jupiter is connected to travel, also to philosophical or religious, spiritual matters. So there may be more of that in your life as well. Maybe a general sense of luckiness, if you believe in luck, or alignment with whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. But at the same time, expansion, maybe even geographically. And I think that with Saturn here in the first house, this could also be connected to work or the career, because Saturn rules the 10th house of career. So you have the 9th house and the 10th house in the first house, the influences of those two houses in the first house. And so I'm thinking that it could be along those lines. But it's actually, it's just good for your life in general, for bringing in new things, or, like expanding your life in some way, whether it's geographically, whether it's through your mind or your your intellect, I should say, but in a more abstract way, and a positive outlook. So broadening your perspective. And then with Saturn, we're talking about being in the body. So we have the first house is the body, and Saturn is this planet that is particularly associated with Capricorn, which is an earth sign. And Saturn is about discipline, about ambition, organization. And so this is a great time for people that want to have some kind of discipline in their diet and their health in general. Although the first house is not the house of health, that is the 6th house. The first house is the body. So anything that you're doing to maybe improve yourself, because that's the other thing I should say about Jupiter in the first house, is this idea of self-improvement. And that might be something that is a theme in 2021 for you. One thing that I want to note is that there is going to be a time in 2021 when Jupiter actually goes into Pisces for a bit. I think it's from May until July. I actually had looked it up and now I don't have it in front of me, but it's going to be for a few months, and then it's going to go back, it's going to retrograde into Aquarius, and it's going to stay in Aquarius for the rest of the year. Now, I have been doing astrological forecasts for 5.5 years now, approximately. And I have never seen Jupiter go into 2 signs within 1 year that I can remember. So, I don't want to talk outside of the truth, and I want to be accurate, but from what I can remember, this is the first time. So you are going to have a little taste of Jupiter going into the 2nd house of earned income, which of course can be wonderfully expansive for your finances. So that might be a theme as well. I'm not going to get too much into that until 2022, or, maybe a year from now when I'm doing those forecasts. But in any case, getting back to Saturn, this is a sobering time for you. So, you could look at Saturn in the 12th house as the dark night of the soul. And you have had very briefly for about, I would say, 6 weeks, you had Jupiter in Aquarius at 0 degrees of Aquarius. It might have gone up to 1 degree or something. And this was from March, the end of March, until the beginning of May of 2020. And so you had a little taste of it in the first house and then went back into the 12th. And starting in July, it went back into the 12th. And this can be very challenging to have Saturn in the 12th house because, it's kind of like, to me, having Saturn in the 12th house is like when people have to retire, especially if they're forced to retire, they're a certain age, and the company that they're working for doesn't want to pay them anymore, or they think that they're past their prime. And these people didn't want to retire, but they're forced to, and they're kind of like staring at the walls. And that sounds pretty bleak, doesn't it? But it's like they still have this ambition, but they have nowhere to go. The 12th house is a monk's house. It's a hermit's house. So it's supposed to be a place of contemplation. It's also, interestingly, the 12th house can be prisons and hospitals. And these are other places of a confinement. And so when people have not developed themselves spiritually, they tend to be a one-trick pony, and they're just so caught up in their career, or they're so attached to it, that when they are forced to retire, or maybe they have some kind of illness and then they end up retiring because of that, they become debilitated, they don't have anything else to fall back on. Even if they're married or they have children and grandchildren or what have you, they still feel lost. And so this may have been a time of some kind of confinement or some kind of a challenge which forced you to be, to have, restricted movement, that forced you to kind of like contemplate your life. Like if somebody forced you to be a hermit, well, join the club. I think a lot of us have felt like that from one degree to the other, however you say that. And it's something that if you are a person who considers yourself already very contemplative, that you reflect upon things a lot, then it's not going to be a big deal. You're going to, sail through with flying colors. But for other people, it might have been a time of great emotional discomfort. And also, like I said, there's like this karmic connection with the 12th house, where people might have to confront some of their demons, some of the ghosts of the past that have come to the surface, floated to the surface. So now in the first house, this is a very, straightforward place that is about in terms of your physical body. I wrote down here in the body, because it's really about connecting to that self that is really, we could say, is not the true self, but in this lifetime, it certainly is something that we have to look at, and that could be on multiple levels. For instance, Saturn in the first house can be when somebody finally feels their age. Now, if you're gone through your second, Saturn return, if Saturn is going back, if you have Saturn in Aquarius, in your, as somebody in their late 50s, I don't know if that's possible, because I don't know the years. I think that is possible, because I have Saturn in Pisces, and that's coming up for me, my second Saturn return. But anyway, that can be a time when it's like, wow, I can't deny it anymore. I'm not a kid anymore. I mean, obviously, if you're in your late 50s, you're not, but anybody, you might be 40 years old. It doesn't have to be your second Saturn return. I mean, you might be 40 and you're starting to really see, and that might kind of prompt a little bit of a midlife crisis. If you feel that you're starting to age, even in your 30s, you might feel that way. But there's a realism that has to take root. Sobering up, maybe even from an addiction, coming from the 12th house for sure. For some people who have a tendency to burn the candle at both edges, at both ends, you might realize that you have to slow down. But yeah, I didn't say this about Saturn in the 12th house. Some of you may be listening while Saturn is still there, and depending on your degree of ascendant, you may spend a great portion of 2021 with Saturn still in that 12th house. So it's worth mentioning the progression from the 12th to the first house and how that may affect you. That may be a time when you tackle an addiction. And then in the first house, you have to start a new health program or just a whole life program that where you are disciplining yourself, and not just kind of freely doing whatever that you used to do because you want to limit temptation or you want to change those patterns. So one of the things that Saturn in the first house can do is give you, it's about laying down foundation so that you can have future success with, for instance, your career attainment, those goals, the attainment of your goals in terms of career, in terms of your, body goals, whatever it is, your life in general. And so this is a time to get serious, but also to get realistic. Now, how can these two planets work together? As I record this, Jupiter is still in Capricorn, and Jupiter in Capricorn was considered like a mishmash because Jupiter, what they represent are like, totally butting up against each other. Jupiter is this excess and this exuberance, and Saturn is this sobriety and constriction. And, being very conservative, conserving, keeping, saving. And sometimes Jupiter can be about wasting or being very generous. And how do they combine? Well, I think they can combine beautifully because they can make a person, and I'm speaking in terms of having Jupiter and Saturn both in the same sign in that first house. They can make you aware of how less is more, where you don't have to, in order to be happy in life, you don't have to spend too much money, or you don't have to burn the candle at both ends, that you can actually have a simpler existence, but at the same time, so in other words, the Jupiter influence might be more philosophical, where you're learning that life isn't just about the material. Now, I think that Aquarius isn't really a materialistic sign in and of itself, so that might not be something that you have to learn, but just using that as an example. So it can bring opportunities to you, but it can also make you appreciate them and make the most of them. Because sometimes, again, with Jupiter, it can be like kind of like overly optimistic, maybe being a little bit, seeing the big picture, but not seeing the little details and not taking full advantage of something, because you don't realize that you have to put your own effort into it too. You can't just expect everything to be one-sided and just come your way. So that to me is a great combination, because you get the luck, you attract these great experiences, but then you make the most of them through rolling up your sleeves and getting down to business. So both of these signs will form a conjunction at 0 degrees of Aquarius around the solstice time. Winter in the northern hemisphere, summer in the southern. And so we already have this power period when the sun is going into a cardinal sign, in this case Capricorn. And then at that same time, we have these two planets that are entering Aquarius. And so I think Jupiter enters officially on the 18th. It's right around the 17th and 18th of December, I believe, when this happens. So, but they formed that alignment around the 20th, 21st. So, this being ostensibly in your first house, obviously For some of you, a lot of you, this is going to actually begin in the 12th house and then proceed into the first house. Most of you, this is going to start in the 12th house. But you will experience it in 2021 at some point in the first house. So anyway, Aquarius, I hope that you enjoyed this. If you would like me to look at your natal chart, please click on the link below to see the type of readings I offer. Take care. Bye.